We're good? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2010 Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture. I am Richa Shivakoti from the Social Science Baha. This is the 8th in the series of lectures hosted by the Social Science Baha to honor the late historian Mahesh Chandra Regmi's contribution to Nepali scholarship. I would now like to request Hari Sharma, a member of the Social Science Baha, to welcome Professor Ostrom. The Mahesh Chandra Regmi lectures were initiated in 2003 with the first lecture delivered by the late Harka Gurung in the presence of Mahesh Chandra Regmi himself. Since then, we've had the honor of hosting renowned scholars representing different disciplines of the social sciences. In 2004, it was Kumar Pradhan. In 2005, Jared Tofan. In 2006, Michael Opitz. In 2007, Ashish Nandi. In 2008, David Ludden. And in 2009, Romila Thapar, each of them luminaries in their own right. Can I request everyone to switch off their cell phones, please? This year, it is my honor to welcome Professor Elinor Ostrom, or Lynn as we fondly call her. This is a special honor for me, as I've known her since my childhood. As an adult, I also had the good fortune of having her as my professor and advisor during my graduate studies in the US. She has always been such an inspiration to me. Lynn has been a longtime friend of Nepal, and with a lot of her fieldwork focused here. And I know she holds a very special place in her heart for our country. To formally introduce Professor Ostrom, we have with us George Verghese, a member of the Social Science Baha. Without any delay, I would now like to request Dr. Verghese to introduce Professor Ostrom. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, colleagues and friends, good afternoon and thank you for coming. I have the privilege of introducing this year's distinguished speaker for the annual Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture. It is a privilege for me, particularly because in the 20 years that I've known her, this is the first opportunity I've had to introduce her to such a gathering. So thanks to the Social Science Baha for that privilege. Our speaker today is known to many in this room and in Nepal, so I'll only say that her dedicated decades-long study of Nepali examples of governance of natural resources by local communities has been critical in bringing local governance back into the discourse that has tended to focus on state solutions or market solutions. As you all know, her recent Nobel Prize noted this very significant contribution to our world. The subject of local governance is dear to me, but also dear to many of us at the Social Science Baha, and indeed to my own organization, the Asia Foundation. It is also a matter of great importance with regard to the development of our new constitution in Nepal. Therefore, it was a great pleasure for all of us to work closely with the government to bring her here to Nepal, and I'm particularly grateful to my friend Hari here, who worked with the President's office, and to the Chief Secretary in the Prime Minister's office for their assistance. Our speaker today embodies what it means to be truly interdisciplinary. From her early book, Governing the Commons, written in 1990, to her latest book, Working Together, released earlier this year, and all the research she's done in between, herself and with all her students and peers, she has really shown us how to gain pleasure and results from working with diverse individuals. She has been recognized by prestigious academies of arts and sciences, philosophy, political science, political economy, economic research, and most recently, as you all know, the economic sciences. It is appropriate, therefore, that she is giving today a lecture that is in the memory of an economic historian. Friends, as a founding member of the Social Science Baha, and a very strong supporter of the Baha from the very beginning, and on behalf of the Asia Foundation, I am proud to introduce my teacher and my friend, Elinor Ostrom. I invite Lynn to come and deliver the 2010 Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture. Lynn.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I thank you very much for this wonderful invitation. And being back in Nepal has just been wonderful for me. The only problem is it is a short visit, but that is because of a very large number of commitments that were made before we were able to work this out, but it's wonderful. I'm going to be talking today about institutions and resources, and I'm going to be dealing with the problem that many important environmental goods and services that are important to us all, water, forests, pasture lands, etc., are essential for our future, and in some respects we can call them common pool resources. And all common pool resources share a couple of characteristics. One of them is that they are available to a subset of individuals that is hard to exclude them. So a fishery, for example, it's in the ocean. It's very hard to exclude people from, it's costly to exclude people from the fishery. It is also the case that common pool resources, one person's subtraction takes out units that aren't available to others. So when I harvest from a stream and bring in water to my home or to my farm field, nobody else can use that water. Similarly with fish or forests or others. Thus there's a very large number of important resources in the field that we can call and should call common pool resources. Now that's different than the institutions that relate to those. So by institutions I mean the rules that humans use when interacting within a wide variety of different settings. So individuals who regularly interact, for example, sometimes use rules that are designated by a governmental authority. So the rule is a governmental rule. They may also develop and design and enforce their own rules, so that rules come within a family. I remember my mother very distinctly telling me the rules of our family. Within a community, within a group using water resources. You're taking my flowers. Those are my resource units. Individuals may also adopt norms in addition to rules that are the do's and don'ts that, again, a small community or a larger group feels are essential, but they may not enforce them with sanctions like they will with rules. And most important, when individuals interact repeatedly within settings, they may change these rules and norms, and thus they may evolve over time as different problems are faced. Okay, now one of the big problems that people have faced is what is called the open access problem. And one of the very first descriptions of the problem was by Scott Gordon way back in 1954, who was dealing with the whole problem of open fisheries and showed that if the fishery was totally open, nobody had any exclusive rights to it, that people would dramatically overharvest in comparison to an optimal harvesting level. Now, this was a static model, very powerful, long before Garrett Hardin wrote The Tragedy of the Commons, but has been a foundation in economics for thinking about these problems. But the static model has been used repeatedly to show why common pool resources that generate very valuable resources will be overharvested. And I mean, in the literature, it's will. We have to be thinking of it as may rather than will. And we have to then understand what are some of the differences that change a situation that has been predicted always to lead to overharvesting to a situation where sometimes it is and sometimes not, and in some cases people manage resources very well, so they build them and enhance them over time rather than subtracting from them. Clark Gibson, pardon me, Colin Clark, a very famous economist, refers to the models of Scott Gordon and others as stick figures. He is himself a very famous mathematical economist, and he's using the term stick figure as that sometimes using a stick figure gives you a really important insight to something, very simplified and very precise, but when you turn to okay, am I hearable? When a stick figure is used as the foundation for policy, the policy may turn out to be a stick figure, overly simplified and not really precise enough to deal with the specifics of situation. Now, a great deal of the public policy literature in economics and in political science has recommended optimal institutions. So you have a mathematical model. It shows that everything is being overharvested. There's a optimal point, and there is the point where it is predicted, which is not optimal. And so simply moving the point from overextending back to optimal is the way that people recommend in terms of, okay, all we have to do is change the rules from open access to this, and we fixed it. Well, the recommendation is frequently, okay, have a government reserve or privatize it or whatever. And what we've found is that many of these recommendations have, in some settings, been successful. But they are not a panacea. They are not universally successful. And that's what we need to be acquiring, is a much more nuanced view of the richness of the world and the richness of the institutions that people can devise for managing it. Currently, more than 100,000 protected areas already exist in the world. And they include approximately 10% of all forested land. While much enthusiasm exists for creating some more, what we are finding from a wide diversity of different studies is that some perform well and some are a disaster. The areas being heavily harvested right inside the protected areas. A study that was undertaken as part of a project that some of us in the room are a part of, the International Forestry Resources and Institutions Project, looked at 76 government-owned protected forests and 87 forests owned by private companies, by government but not protected, by communities, etc., a wide diversity. And found absolutely no difference in the forest density of the forest being examined. so that it was a large statistical study with no statistical difference. A large study that was conducted then by the World Wildlife Fund included over 200 protected areas in 27 different countries. WWF found that many protected areas lacked key financial and human resources and a sound legal basis, and they did not have effective control over their boundaries. So due to these kinds of conditions, there's a lot of conflict over boundaries, and there's many times that there's a very difficult time around the protected areas. Our own research found that some of protected areas were well protected and others not. In an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, Harini Najendra and I show that a wildlife preserve in India has been very successfully prevented deforestation using remote sensing over time, but is very expensive. So that in order to be successful and really keep those boundaries in firm shape, the budget is extremely high. Looking again at another reserve, the Todoba Andhari Tiger Reserve, that has only a modest budget, when you look at the remote sensing, you see massive intrusions where people have been coming in and deforesting. The very large number of cases both ways. Well, then some people say private property is the way. And again, sometimes we find it successful and other times not. A lot of the land that is deforested and people are upset about is private. But there are ways of using private property that are a little broader than the way it is normally thought about. I was able to do a study in my doctoral work that turned out to be my dissertation of groundwater evolution of property rights in Southern California. And if you have a groundwater basin right underneath Los Angeles metropolitan area, and it's right next to the ocean, as you start pumping and pull the water down, not only do you have the basin depleted, but salt water is pouring in. There were over 700 pumpers from this basin, and they varied in size from parts of 11 different cities, Standard Oil, parts of Los Angeles County, and small-scale farmers. And when I studied it, by the way, I didn't know I was studying the commons. I was studying the evolution of rights for a groundwater basin. What they did was fascinating in that they used a wide diversity of different mechanisms to eventually develop private property rights. The first thing they did was create a private association where they could meet and talk about these problems, and they had regular monthly meetings and brought in experts, etc. Then they faced the problem of finding out their boundaries. And if you are in an urban area living over a groundwater basin, that's it's a difficult problem to try to figure out where the basin is and then who's sharing that. And they were able to go to the U.S. Geologic Survey and have them, a national scientific agency, that would do local problems when local people were willing to pay 1/3, and the report would be public. So they've eventually able to get the boundaries set, and eventually they went to court and got the legal definition of their water rights settled. We've now had a study done, it just defended 2010, that looks over the sweep of 50 years of property rights, and not only did they get private, but they then also created special districts, like a replenishment district, and put very heavy taxes on their property rights. But the tax goes not to Washington or Sacramento. The tax goes to their own district, and they've used it to develop ways of spreading reclaimed sewer water, where they get the quality very good, and they're now reclaiming salt water and injecting it in the basin. So after 50 to 60 years, in that case, the basin has regained a great height and is doing extremely well, not just because they privatized, but because they were able to get their rights clear and then assess themselves heavily and use that assessment for management of their own basin rather than having tax money going wandering off. Well, some people recommend individual transferable quota systems for fishery as a way of privatizing, another institutional arrangement. And some of those have been successful, but there are costs to those that are. For example, the British Columbia trawl fishery for groundfish just absolutely collapsed after World War II, so it was overfished. Hardin was right in that instance. They let it, they collapsed it, the government came in and said no more fishing, let it regrow. And they eventually developed a variety of institutional arrangements, but the current one is that every boat has been assigned a quota that they can catch in a year, but they must have a government employee on the boat that observes every net that they bring up and records it. Many problems have occurred with transferable quota systems where people bring in to sell their quota, but they have pulled up a lot more and they've just thrown away a great deal of fish as, quote, bycatch, because that's not what they get the money for, so they just throw it back in the ocean. And bycatch is a very difficult problem for many fisheries. And in British Columbia now, they have a private system, individual transferable quota, and it's working, and there's bycatch is way down, but it's very expensive. So if you have to have an observer paid to be right on the boat in order to be out exercising your rights, that's costly. Now, common pool resources are frequently recommended to be community managed, and again, like government or private, we find both successes and failures. Strong involvement of a local community is frequently very important for success, but it is not a panacea. And sometimes the efforts just to create a government program that decentralizes it uniformly in a country, that all forests or all forests in a region or all water systems are decentralized with a single act so that the rules are the same everywhere. These have frequently not worked because it's rare in any country that all the resources of a particular kind have the same structure. And in Nepal, it is certainly very obvious that the Terai and the middle hills and the upper hills are dramatically different, and what works in one region is not necessarily going to work in another. So there's little evidence that simply turning over on a widespread basis with a uniform way of doing it will be a solution. And some people think that my research says that's what we should do, and I want to be very strong. That is not what our research says we should do. We have to be much more intuitive in figuring out how to help people who are well informed about the resources that they're using to craft rules and ways of managing them that fit that ecology, rather than just having a uniform set. Sometimes I use a marriage as an example of a common property arrangement. And while we all have marriage laws that we have to be following, most families work out things in somewhat different ways. In my family, I pay the checks and I keep the accounts. In many families, it is the man, the husband, that does that. And in my family, up until quite recently, my husband did a fair amount of the cooking. And now at 91, he isn't, but for a very, very long period of time, he was in the kitchen a lot. And so those patterns of what husband and wife will do and the kids, they vary from household to household, and when they don't, there can be some pretty substantial difference. Well, let's go back to some of the research we've done in Nepal. We've had a very large program that compared farmer-managed to agency-managed systems, and this is a program that I've carried out with many people in the audience, and if I had not had wonderful Nepali colleagues, we would not have been able to do this research. But one of the things that we have found is that while many farmer-managed systems do an excellent job, and I'll give you a little bit more detail in a moment, they do so because they have developed rules that they agree on and they follow. But those rules will be different from one system to the next. So if we, right now we still don't know for certain the number of farmer-managed irrigation systems in Nepal, and the reason that we don't is that many are located in far distant places. At one point there was an estimate, but the best estimate is around 20,000 systems, but that may be a little bit updated now, but it is, so many of them are self-organized that not everybody has the detail of how many there are out there in the world. The estimate was also that it was 75% of the land, irrigated land in Nepal, is served by farmer-managed. Many of these systems were actually constructed by and maintained by farmers, the techniques that they had were not highfalutin engineering. If you visited back in the country, like many of us have done, you will see people who have hand dug a canal, who have lined it with local stones, who have a headworks that is made out of big logs, but after a monsoon, the logs have been carried away, and so the next year one has to do a good deal of the construction again. A bunch of us in here, in terms of Ganesh Shivakoti and Paul Benjamin, who's not here in the room, and several others who have been very, very much involved in this, have now studied over 230 irrigation systems in Nepal, in 29 out of the 75 districts. And our consistent finding, and that of others who have done similar research, but not at quite that scale, is that on average, farmer-managed irrigation systems outperform agency-managed on a variety of dimensions. When we did the analysis, we looked at a variety of variables to assess performance, and we found that it was the farmers who organized, in this case, was the most important explanatory factor. We looked at 3 measures of performance. The one was the physical condition, and that was our team walked the full line of the canal to look at the condition, and the same for an agency-managed system. And a condition of a canal that is in better shape enables water to get further in the system, so there's more water at the tail end. So that there's better condition of the canal, more equitable distribution of the canal, and more efficient management in terms of costs and benefits. We also looked at the kinds of formal rules they had and found that there were formal rules in both systems. But in 8 out of 10 agency-managed systems, they hire an official guard, and the other 2 they don't. While only in 6 out of 10 farmer-managed have an official guard. In the rest of the farmer-managed systems, they rotate. So you have responsibility to go up and down the canal every 1 day a month, or 1 day every 2 weeks, or some rotation system. On 75% of the farmer-managed systems, fines are actually imposed when farmers are observed to break a rule. So they're a little tough on people who are observed to break a rule. But on the agency-managed, it's only about 38% where somebody has overtly broken a rule and has a fine imposed on them. The rules actually in use vary dramatically. So sometimes the official guard is rotating. One of the things that is done is a frequent way of designing who takes water at what time in what manner, and clearing those distributional questions so that that's very clear. And especially when people do rotation systems by location, if George is able to take water first from 8 to 12, then I have 12 to 4, and Risha has 4 to 8. We're right at the canal at the time of the transfer. So I don't want you to take any more water than you are due, and you don't want me to start early and on down the canal. But that is a very low-cost way of monitoring because we don't have to have a guard at that point. We're just guarding everyone else, and it's clear. So this is done repeatedly. In a new book that Ganesh Shivakoti and Prashanda Pradhan and Danny Lamb and I are working on, we've been looking at a very imaginative effort to improve systems in Sindhu-Pachak, and this was a system that did not make huge monetary investment, but it enabled the farmers from systems that were not working quite as well as they could to visit other systems in Pulpa, where in general the systems were in excellent shape. And so it used farmer-to-farmer training. We sometimes are always worried, how do you train them? And we think we have to have PhDs or very high degree engineers out there training. And sometimes that is helpful. But sometimes having training sessions where farmers are moving into other irrigation systems managed by other farmers and learning from them, or forest groups or whatever, can be very, very effective. Now, we've also been studying forests around the world. The International Forestry Resources and Institutions Program in Bolivia, Colombia, Guatemala, India, Kenya, Mexico, Nepal, Tanzania, Thailand, Uganda, and the United States. And we have a new center now starting in Ethiopia. It is the only interdisciplinary study of forests where we have social scientists working side by side with ecologists and foresters. And again, we've been able to look at a variety of forests around the world. One of the things we've done is look at protected areas versus non, and again, looking at some of these issues. We looked at 76 legally designated protected areas compared with 87 of a wide diversity of other kinds, and we found statistically no difference at all. We then have been returning to a number of sites so that we have a second or a third visit, so you can be looking at change over time, where some forests are going down, 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 some are constant, and some are improving. Ashwini Chhatri and Arun Agrawal have now looked at the conditions of 152 forests under diverse research governance arrangements, and holding a number of factors constant. They were finding that forests that were the most likely to regenerate were those that were in small to medium size, with low levels of subsistence right on them, and high levels of local enforcement. I'll take a sip of water. But again, local monitoring was important. Several other studies have looked at this question and find that when the users of a forest, of a community managed forest, have harvesting rights, they have better forests that are improving, and they are more likely to monitor. And some people say, that's ridiculous. If they can harvest, then why don't they just take down the forest? But if you have harvesting rights to non-timber forest products, or firewood, or careful rotational timber, where you're looking at how to get the entire forest to regenerate over time, you have a long-term interest. You know that if you're careful, and your fellow members of the association or community, whatever it is, however it's organized, are careful, you can be obtaining revenue and goods and services for a very long time. And then people invest in monitoring and making sure that others are taking good care and doing what they're supposed to. So this is one of the factors that we have found repeatedly, and I didn't notice when I started. So, what is my? I have about 15 minutes. Okay, I have a long paper, and I'm not going to read all aspects, but I just need to know where I am. In looking at Nepal, we have a very good study done by George Varghese some time ago, looking at 18 different communities in the Middle Hills of Nepal, and looking at the various ways that people coped with the diversity of social conditions as well as the diversity of ecological conditions. And some forests are big and long, and some people live way over here, and a few people live closer. Well, if you have a requirement that you must monitor, but you have to walk 2 hours to get to the forest to plant or monitor or whatever, that is very difficult for those that live very far away, because they have to put all that time and effort just to get there. Well, in communities that are well organized and understand these problems, they frequently have rules that are uniform for some things like what you can harvest, but then have different rules for your responsibilities for maintenance. If you live nearby, you have certain obligations, but if you live far away, you'll still have some, but you'll pay a fee for continued access. And that fee then is a way of compensating your fellow citizens for their work and maintaining the forest, but doing it in a more equitable way. And so sometimes we think of equity as being just uniform. But the situation that people face related to a forest or a irrigation system is not uniform. And so frequently having rules that differ in a significant way that people see as being equitable. If they're different, they do need to be perceived as equitable, to be sustainable over time. But when they are different and equitable, they are sometimes able to solve rather puzzling problems, and this is where having uniform rules that come down from higher levels are sometimes very substantially difficult. We've been looking at a variety of questions related to differences in wealth, and we have found that heterogeneity in a forest governance unit can sometimes be very challenging for people to cope with, but it is not automatically a condition that leads to failure. But if there's a considerable difference in ethnicity, wealth, caste, other factors, it is not just a routine matter for solving how you create rules that will work. And it takes a lot of thought and a lot of effort. And here is where sometimes creating groups of forest users or water associations can make a big difference. In the area of water, we have now the FMIS group that is the trust, FMIST, that is bringing farmers together on a regular basis to discuss some of the problems they're facing, comparing, learning from one another. And to the extent that we can enhance ways of people organizing and then meeting together to share information about what worked and what hasn't worked, as well as getting technical people to spend time in villages to learn how people are doing and how they might improve. So sometimes scientific knowledge is very useful. Sometimes indigenous knowledge across different systems is very useful. I'm going to then turn to the topic of presuming that we always have optimal institutions, and our problem is to have the social scientists or the engineers design them, and then a recommendation is made to government, here is the optimal, and then the government imposes it everywhere, to a way of looking at multi-level adaptive systems, and the trying to work out ways that the complexity of the ecosystem is matched by the rules that people develop to match it. If we look at the work of Simon Levine and on the ecological side, he writes that most ecosystems are complex, adaptive systems, and hence are characterized by historical dependency, meaning what happened last year affects what's happening this year, affects what's going on in the next year. And multiple basins of attraction, meaning that there are various equilibria possible in an ecology, and depending upon what is done by animals, including the human one, which ones are actually affected depends on that use pattern. The management of such systems presents fundamental challenges made especially difficult by the fact that putative controllers, parenthesis, humans, are essential parts of the system and hence part of the problem. And there are a number of lessons that emerge from the study of complex ecologies and guide it. And one of the important things that the ecologists have learned is the importance of experimentation, learning, and adaptation. So one of our needs as we are thinking about the future is to try to think through how we can recommend the forms of institutions that enable users of resources to adapt, experiment, try something out, learn from one another over time. When we talk about these being complex systems, we shouldn't say, well, because they're so complex we can't do anything. That's not an adequate answer. But just coming up with simple solutions for complex systems is definitely not an answer. So it's how we learn how to get in and see that irrigation system with 10 farmers on a creek, where the creek comes through a cliff and there's no need to maintain the headworks because the water just comes through. That is an entirely different system than when you have 300 farmers with a very expensive headworks into level 1, level 2, and level 3 divisions. The control apparatus for that has to be dramatically different, but that is not always in the textbook. So what we have found now in massive studies around the world is we've studied the actual rules that people are using, and we have not found any one rule that was always beneficial. So I won't bore you with long lists of all the boundary rules that we have found, but we have found over 100 different combinations of characteristics of who is authorized to use a resource, the boundary about the individuals. Well, I have to go back into my own reflection, and back in 1988, after having spent a great deal of time reading these works elsewhere, and before doing a lot of the work here in Nepal, I had a sabbatical and a chance to reflect on it, and I thought, well, everyone's calling for optimal rules. I should find them. I failed. I spent hours and days struggling with trying to find the optimal set of rules for the cases that we had collected. And I finally moved up a level to talk about design principles. And the book Governing the Commons is a result of that struggle. And many people point to that recently as the big finding. I think we've been moving on beyond it, but I still think it was very valuable. And I think to apply what I learned, we have to think about it in multiple ways. And one of the nice things is Michael Cox and several others have just completed a study that's going to be published in Ecology and Society this spring. It's been accepted and typeset, et cetera, just not officially out yet. They studied 96 studies that had looked at the design principles, and were they predictive of success, or when they were present, not present, were there failures. And they found a very, very high rate of success of using them as evaluative criteria for whether or not systems were working or not. 96 different studies. But they also recommended some modest changes so that we could be separating out the conditions about the boundary of users from the boundary of the resource. I had put them together, and they have separated them out. And they've done a couple of other small revisions so that they're now improved. But I think if we were to now think about how you use those design principles, I think the way to use them is not prescriptively. They shouldn't be used that way, but as a source of a variety of questions. And I'm just going to give you a sense of what are the questions that are important to be asking when one is involved in any way with local communities and others trying to manage, or involved with advising government officials about the kinds of questions that should be asked. So one of the ones that successful systems have asked is, how are we going to define the boundaries of the system over time? How are we going to define who is going to be an authorized user? Who is allowed to harvest what kinds of resources. So you'll find in some fisheries, it's not everything they catch, it's a particular species. What will be the timing, quantity, location, and technology used for harvesting? Who is obligated to contribute resources to maintain the resource system itself? Who must give time, effort, and resources? How are harvesting and maintenance activities to be monitored and enforced? How are conflicts over harvesting and maintenance to be resolved? How will cross-scale linkages be dealt with on a regular basis? And how will the rules affecting the above be changed over time with changes in the performance of the resource system or disturbances that come from outside? So I think one of the ways, I've had people wanting me to use those as prescriptions, and what I've done here is convert them from prescriptions, well, they never were, from design principles to questions. And I think they can be used that way, where they give you an initial set of questions that need to be resolved in the designing. It's also important to think about the experimentation with rule systems, and that many times it is feasible if a group has self-organized to start with one set and then change one, see what's happening, change another, see what's happening. It's this, again, adaptation. And we should be proud of groups that do experimentation and adaptation and share their results with others. Because if you don't do that, you don't learn. And rigid use of the same rule over a changing environment is not a very productive way to go. So that is one of the problems of having the rules related to common pool resources made by a single governing authority for an entire nation can be problematic. And I've been battling, not battling this way, but verbally, with colleagues on the eastern coast of the United States. They're trying to get a uniform set of fishery rules for the entire East Coast, and that goes from Maine to Florida. And the variety of ecological systems from Maine to Florida is rather dramatic. So that in fisheries, the rules that are appropriate for Maine fisheries, which are now quite successful, will not work outside of the environment that they were designed for. So we then should expect in any design process that there will be a probability of error, and thus having redundant teams of designers has repeatedly been shown to be of considerable advantage. If you talk with engineers who are working with airplane design, it is a very frequent thing that there are 2 or 3 teams on the same question of who's going to design the wing, the tail, the engine, and then they put those different designs in wind tunnels and try to give them all sorts of testing to see which one works and which one works best with other designs. So I was flabbergasted to attend a meeting on robust design and listen to the process of designing engineering for airplanes. One, I realized how incredibly difficult it was, and I got scared for a while, because I realized that you could have wind power coming along, you could have a flat tire, you could have a single wing fall off, just an incredible array of things. But I also was somewhat reassured because the effort was to know that there are huge numbers of disturbances, and getting an airplane all the way from New Delhi to Kathmandu is a challenge, depending on weather conditions and everything else. And that is something that they're constantly working at to try to improve, so they don't stay with just one design. They are always struggling with these issues. And we, I think, would be better off thinking about the design of local institutions more like the engineers think about the design of airplanes than thinking about a single designer sitting, making at a table and designing a simple instrument, and that's it. Adaptation, change, experimentation are all very important for the long-term sustainability of complex systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ostrom, for your very insightful lecture. And thank you also for taking time off to be with us today. I know you have a very busy schedule. Since this is a public lecture, we won't be entertaining any questions from the audience, but please do make sure to pick up a copy of today's lecture as you leave the hall. I would also like to mention that this year's lecture has been made possible with the support of the Alliance for Social Dialogue and the Asia Foundation. I would now like to invite everyone for refreshments out in the garden. This will be an opportunity to interact with Professor Ostrom. With this, we now conclude the Mahesh Chandra Regmi Lecture 2010. Thank you all for your attendance.